January 6th, 1976 was Mona Stafford's 36th birthday. To celebrate, she and her friends Louise Smith and Elaine Thomas decided to drive 35 miles from their home in Liberty, Kentucky to have dinner at the Redwoods restaurant between Stanford and Lancaster, Kentucky. Louise Smith was driving them in her 67 Chevy Nova. The three women had an enjoyable dinner together. None of them drank any alcoholic beverages with their meal. Yeah, right. At about 11:15, the trio headed back home, expecting to be home by midnight. At Stanford, Kentucky, 9 miles from Lancaster, they turned off Highway 27 and onto Highway 78 towards Hustonville. Just outside Stanford, a curious thing happened. A bright red object appeared in the sky, which Mona Stafford, at first, thought was an airplane on fire. As the object descended from the right side of the road to a point ahead of them, they could see that it was not an airplane, but a huge object, bigger than 2 houses. It was as big as a football field, Miss Smith said.
Wow.
The object stopped about 100 yards ahead of them, stretching across the road on both sides. It rocked back and forth for a couple of seconds and then moved off to the left. Hold on just a second. Let me just, for real quick. Seriously, man, can you imagine just like all of a sudden this huge thing that just goes across both sides of this road is just right in front of your car?
Yeah, as big as a football field.
Oh my gosh.
Jeez.
So they kept driving and assumed that whatever it was had kept going. However, after they had been about a quarter of a mile, a blue light appeared through the rear window of the car. At first, they thought it was, a highway patrol car with its lights flashing. But soon, they realized that the flying object had circled around and had come up behind them. Suddenly, something wrestled control of the car away from Louise Smith. The car accelerated, even though Miss Smith took her foot off of the accelerator, and the speedometer was soon on 85 miles per hour. Mona Stafford in the front passenger seat tried to help Louise regain control of the car, but was not possible. The women began to feel a burning sensation in their eyes. The ignition lights lit up on the instrument panel, an indication that the car's engine was stalled, but they were still speeding along. They saw a wide, brightly lit road ahead of them, and then, seconds later, the scene in front of them became Highway 78. A full 8 miles from where they had just been. Checking the time, they found that incredibly, 1 hour and 20 minutes had passed. They arrived at Louise Smith's trailer in Liberty at about 1:25 a.m., almost an hour and a half later than they had initially expected. They went inside to collect themselves and found that each had a red mark like a burn on the backs of their necks. And they all had that burning, irritated eyes. Louise Smith went into the bathroom and removed her watch to wash her face. She saw that the hands of her watch were spinning at a much higher than normal speed.
Wow.
When she splashed water on her face, she found that contact with the water caused pain in both her hands and her face. So they went next door to their neighbor, a guy named Mr. Lowell Lee, and they told him what just happened. He had them separately sketch the object that they had seen. The sketches were extremely similar, if not identical. They called the police and the local Navy office, but neither showed any interest in their story. In the days that followed, Mona Stafford had more problems with her eyes than did the other two women, and she sought medical help for severe conjunctivitis. Louise Smith's pet parakeet was now inexplicably terrified of her, and the bird died a couple of months later. Smith's car also began to develop mysterious electrical problems. The Navy office reportedly gave information about the story to the news media, and the story was soon in the newspapers. Hearing of the case, Jerry Black of MUFON,
Mutual UFO Network,
that's right, set up an interview with the three women. Also, J. Allen Hynek of SUFOS, how do you say that? The Center of UFO Studies?
Hynek is awesome. Yeah.
And Jim and Coral Lorenzen of APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization.
I don't know.
also investigated the case. The investigators found that other individuals had independently reported sightings of a UFO in the Casey and Lincoln counties that same night. In July of 1976, Lexington Police Department Detective James Young separately gave the three women lie detector tests regarding this experience. They all passed with no problems. Later that same evening and continuing into the next day, extensive hypnotic regression of the women was performed by Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle. And here's what happened within the regressions or whatever. Here's what they remembered.
Listen closely to this exclusive portion of Dr. Sprinkle's original hypnotic interview with Louise Smith, and note her anguish as she relives the experience.
It was right over.
It's right over you? Okay. Okay.
What is it? Oh. It looks like it's going to crash. God, what is it?
Didn't know what it was. It was so really frightening. What happens now?
I don't want to look at it no more.
It's so frightening, it's hard to look at.
Yeah. I'm so bright. My eyes hurt.
The light hurts your eyes.
All three of the women remembered vividly what had taken place during the lost 80 minutes that they were brought aboard a UFO. Elaine Thomas reported that she had been lying on her back in a long, narrow, incubator-like chamber. The humanoids looked to her like small, dark figures, which she estimated to be about 4 feet tall. So she reported that a blunt instrument was pressed hard against her chest, causing a lot of pain, while something else encircled her throat. Each time she tried to speak, she was choked.
Jeez.
She cried softly under hypnosis as though reliving a horrible ordeal. It felt like hands pressing on her throat, and she could see shadowy figures passing all around her. They won't let me breathe. I can't get away, she cried. Under hypnosis, Mrs. Smith said that she had been in a dark, hot place and something had been fitted over her face. She begged the occupants to let her see, but when they did, she immediately closed her eyes, as what she saw was so frightening.
I don't want to look at it no more.
She could not describe the beings, however. She told investigators that the interior of the UFO was very dark and that she was very frightened. She pleaded with the kidnappers to let her go, to let go of her arm. She finally cried out, "I'm so weak, I want to die."
Wow.
Still, later, she asked the beings if she could go, and the next memory she had was that of seeing a streetlight. Mona Stafford's memory was of lying on a bed in what seemed to be an operating room, with her right arm pinned down by some invisible force, while 3 or 4 figures dressed in white gowns sat around her bed. Apparently, Mrs. Stafford was not as overcome with terror as the others, but she did say that she seemed to remember being tortured and that at one point her eyes felt as if they were being jerked out of her head. Her stomach felt as though it had been blown up like a balloon. Next, she reported that the humanoids were pulling at her feet, then bending them backward and twisting them. "I can't take any more," she screamed, then lapsed into silence. The next thing the 3 frightened women could remember was driving to their neighbor's house. The time was actually 1:30 a.m. Nearly an hour and 20 minutes were missing from their lives that night. Louise reported that her neck hurt, and when Mona examined it, she saw that strange red mark, about 3 inches long and 1 inch wide, like a burn that had not blistered. Elaine's neck had the same type of mark on it. Although the burn marks were gone in about 2 days, the 3 women still could not account for their time lost nor recall anything from the time the car was pulled backward until they were driving about 8 miles from where they first saw the UFO. Following the hypnotic sessions, they were given the polygraph test by Detective James Young of the Lexington Police Department. Young, in a sworn statement, said, "It is my opinion that these women actually believe they did experience an encounter." Dr. Sprinkle, who performed the regressions, stated that
The contortions and the crying that these women showed, during the hypnosis, and it would make a believer out of you.
the three women, in his opinion, had specific impressions that indicated to them that they had been observed and handled by strange beings. He felt it would have been impossible for them to fake their reactions, and he commented that their experience during the time lost was similar to reports provided by UFO recipients who had similar experiences. The report of abduction by aliens, memory loss, missing time, and the shape of the UFO are all familiar to UFO investigators. For this is not an isolated episode. The three women were all known to be lifelong churchgoers with excellent reputations in their community. It is, in reality, but one more report of a physical examination of Earth humans by beings from other points in time or space. Hey, all you alien grays and abductees. Welcome back to another episode of your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad. A podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. We are your hosts, Woody Brown.
And Tyler Bentz.
What's up, brother?
Well, I love this story.
Man alive,
It's
right?
awesome. Yeah. Just dead silence
That's it,
then.
huh?
I answered the
And
question.
there's our episode, guys. Last week we had one of the longest episodes ever, and this week we're just going to keep it short. So there you go. Have a wonderful week.
Thanks for stopping
We
by.
want to thank our sponsor. Yeah.
And as always,
Yeah, man, this story, when I came across it, well, first let me just say this. We have been wanting to do a UFO episode
oh yeah.
even before the podcast started, right? Yeah, it's something that we've been wanting to talk about forever, but just like any of the other stuff that we're into, like Bigfoot or cryptids or really just paranormal and stuff, there's just so many accounts, there's just so much back information and just tons and tons of stuff that it kind of gets intimidating because you just don't know where to begin. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of part of the reason why we've not avoided talking about it, but just haven't really gotten there yet. But I got to say, man, I feel like the universe was trying to tell us something or whatever, because literally,
Oh, I'm psyched about this.
I guess it was just a couple nights ago. We talked about this on the last podcast. I think that, every night that we can, that it's not raining or something, my family and I will go out into the backyard and, get a
ritual.
fire in the fire pit going and roast marshmallows, and the kids will run around and kind of work off that chocolate and marshmallows that they just ate. And we just kind of relax, and it's just like the perfect time of year for that because it's still kind of cold, but not too cold so that you can be outside. And so we're sitting there, and all of a sudden my wife says, "Hey, is that a drone?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Because usually you can hear a drone coming.
Yeah,
you hear the
they're
little
pretty
like,
loud.
right? Even the quiet ones, you can still hear them.
And it's that like sort of, even though it's not necessarily so loud, it's like that really high frequency. It sounds like a weed eater almost, like a...
Yeah, or like an insect, something. You can tell it's something, right, flying above. And if you've been around them enough, then you kind of recognize that as, oh, there's a drone. Well, I didn't hear anything, so I looked up, and pretty high up above us, I saw what I guess could have been a drone initially. I thought, well, and then I was like, well, I don't hear any noise. But as I looked up at it, it did like this weird, like back over front sort of like tumble maneuver, and then just a maneuver that a drone couldn't do, right? And then like did a couple other twists and turns and stuff, and like what is it called? Like a roll, I guess. I'm not super well read in aircraft maneuvers, but it did like a roll maneuver, and then it just kept on flying overhead. And I thought, and the first thing I thought of was like, I got to grab my phone and take a video of this because I don't know what this thing is. It's not, it was kind of triangular in shape, and it was really high up there, And so I thought at first, my first initial reaction was, is it a piece of trash? And then I'm like, how does a piece of trash, how does a piece of trash fly up that high? And then second to that was like, well, maybe it's just like, a party balloon that somebody let go and whatever. But it was black with no markings on it. Again, yes, it was pretty high, but for the most part, there was still enough light outside that you would have been able to see some sort of like shimmer of like, that balloon material.
Yeah, the Mylar balloons.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see any of that. It was like flat black. Mm-hmm. And
it was.
It just kept.
I didn't even think about that, but it was kind of like a flat.
Just like flat black. And it just kept on going kind of in the direction that it was headed the whole time, but doing like weird sort of like maneuvers, really.
Yeah.
And then, so I get out my phone and I record a little bit of footage as best I can. And then, and we'll put this up on our Instagram so you can see the real footage there. But I asked my son, I'm like, do you think it was a UFO? And he's like, oh yeah. So
that's what I'm talking about.
A couple things that first, it was just like, you know what? We just got to do a UFO episode now because, we just have to. Mm-hmm. And then second, like it taught me that, one of my biggest beefs, not that I am a skeptic of UFOs in general. I actually, especially after reading some of these books that we'll talk about, really think that there's absolutely, unidentified flying objects all over the place that have been seen for centuries.
Definitely.
But I'm skeptical a lot of the time of the footage that we see, Not only is it shaky, but sometimes you're like, well, that looks, because videography has advanced and special effects has advanced in such a way now that like you can, even with some pretty like cheap applications and stuff, you can make a pretty convincing video that, can make something look like it is flying above, whatever. Mm-hmm. But looking back at my footage, I couldn't, the dang object was so high up at that point once I grabbed my phone, which another argument always is like, why don't we have more like just clear footage? Yeah. Everybody has just really good cameras on their phones now, yada, yada, yada. They've always got them. I've always got my phone with me or in my pocket. Still, it took me a while to open it up, get the camera out, point it up towards the sky. At that point, I couldn't see it anymore, so I zoomed in. And you'll see when you watch this footage, like it's pretty shaky and it's not the best, And so it kind of taught me like the realistic, I guess, expectation to have and to use as like a judge for all of the footage, whether it's UFOs or especially Bigfoot, man. Like I would say, like if you're in a forest and you see a gigantic creature, it's going to scare the crap out of you. You're not going to be able to film it very well.
You're just going to be running, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that kind of prompted this episode's topic. And then whenever I was just kind of going through one of the several books that we have, I just thought this was actually like a really kind of good story to talk about. That's, it's not, I guess, super famous. I mean, it's not as famous as like, say, like Betty and Barney Hill.
Right.
And then, for the listeners that have never heard of that one, you just Google it. But
and we'll do that episode. That's
and we'll talk about that one in depth.
Yeah, classic kind of.
And a lot of similarities to kind of what happened with these ladies as well. Yeah, man. I mean, what did you think about, I guess, what struck you the most about the Stanford abduction?
So for me, I was actually really surprised that you chose this one because it is lesser known. And actually, the interesting part about this one in particular is there's actually several of these that are fairly similar. They're older ladies, they're driving back from somewhere later at night, 11 or 12, and, they see something, their car gets stopped in the middle of, there's one that's almost identical to this that I actually thought this is where you were going with this, because it's almost identical. There's two women in the front seat, their grandson in the back, and it actually ends a little more tragic. That the two ladies end up getting, there's a huge light overhead. It ends up melting the dash on their car. And I can't remember the exact, like what it's called or anything, but it melts the dashboard and the ladies and the kid. Both ladies, their hair ends up falling out, and they end up with cancer. And or basically radiation poisoning, first of all. And I think from what they said, I think a little bit of that probably played into this one as well. I had heard of this one, but I didn't know that the polygraph was totally aced by everybody in the car.
Mm-hmm.
I always think that's really cool. And they had like sort of physical, they walked away with sort of physical sort of ailments caused by the event. I always think that's really interesting. And also, I don't even know if you realize this, but J. Allen Hynek and Leo Sprinkle both are, kind of heavy hitters in the sort of the boots on the ground in the UFO sort of community.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So to have both of those guys kind of show up for this case, it's a pretty big deal.
Right. Kind of bodes well for the authenticity, if
Yeah.
you will. Mm-hmm. And, there were a couple details that kind of stood out to me. One, just like the sheer terror, again, of driving down an old country road or just an old highway and a craft the size of, that just basically goes all the way across both sides of the road, a football field size, pointing lights back at you. That's terrifying. And then losing control of the vehicle and it just constantly like keeping just like it's accelerating. And then all of a sudden, poof. It reminds me of something else we talked about in one of our earlier episodes where it talked about, again, I think it was a couple of females in a car. Mm-hmm. They were driving.
Oh, I know what you're talking
about. And then they
about.
thought they crashed into something, but it ended up being, I want to say we talked about this on the Man from Tard episode.
Was this they saw like the egg creatures?
I think so.
Was
I
it
believe,
the
I think
picnic?
so.
Was this the Picnic Rock?
I don't know. Essentially, they were driving and they saw these I think creatures, and that freaked them out even more. Mm-hmm. And the next thing they know, they crashed into an embankment that wasn't there before.
Right.
And they looked behind them and they didn't just drive through like a weird field or something. So
Mandela effect.
Yeah. No. There's. It's just interesting. And, you mentioned too, like Betty and Barney Hill, mm-hmm. and then that there were a lot of similarities with other cases where it's a couple of, ladies driving late at night and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times anybody listening to this would potentially think, well, kind of sounds to me a little bit like cautionary tales for young ladies late at night driving around. Maybe it's just a way for them to kind of like socially say, hey, stay at home,
stay safe.
Bad things happen. Yeah, that kind of thing. And I get that. Mm-hmm. And anytime there are multiple events around the same time period, it's easier for us now to kind of assume, because of how easy information can spread now in 2021,
right,
that could happen. And certainly I think in the 70s, once things hit the newspaper, could somebody come up with this plan to just have a story and get some infamy and stuff?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. But what's fascinating, this is where I kind of want to talk a little bit about the book Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée, mm-hmm. because what's super interesting to me that never was before, in terms, it wasn't even on my radar, so to speak, mm-hmm. is this correlation between UFOs and
fairy abductions,
otherworldly beings, and how it incorporates into folklore across the span of human history, man. And that's what Passport to Magonia is about. I couldn't recommend this book any more mm-hmm. than, it is just fantastic. And his approach is so cool because he'll be describing an event much like this one, and then he'll jump to one that sounds just almost identical.
Yeah.
And he'll even ask the reader, basically he'll say, now, it's kind of the same way that I just did where, yes, it's easy to assume that, these people had heard of this story. But this happened in Rome, Italy in 1750.
Right.
And you're like,
exactly.
What?
Yeah.
And there are all these historic accounts, man, of, like you said, you mentioned fairies, and that's where we could get so far into the weeds mm-hmm. of stuff, because then it starts getting into like
fairy abductions.
Yeah, fairy abductions.
That to me, that's like that kind of stuff, and that sort of parallel between, the UFO sort of abductee phenomenon, and then 1700s Ireland or Scotland or England, exact same thing. It would be, don't go out too late. The fairies will abduct you and they'll trap you in, fairyland or whatever. It's literally the exact same kind of thing. It's, big, they had big eyes, they had, all that. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I think this is something that has, fortunately for the people, but unfortunately for the lore and like just how cool it was, a lot of the stuff has sort of gone away, I think, in our more modern age. But, I guess late 50s, 60s, and I guess maybe throughout the 70s entirely, there was a lot of like this sort of, with UFOs and abductees and stuff, there was a lot more of the nuts and bolts aspect to it, as far as like your evidential kind of stuff, like the lady's watch, like spinning extra fast, and
the car being
the car like still driving and like speeding up when she pulled her foot off the acceleration. That stuff's really, really cool, and to me, that's kind of just an earmark of that age, of that sort of atomic age Americana that is so cool and so sort of iconic when you think of, what Stanton Friedman would say, you're more nuts and bolts, which is like very, this is an actual thing, this is a metallic craft, and a lot of times they would have rivets, and so I love that stuff.
It's super interesting. And one thing too that always kind of intrigues me is the loss of time stuff.
Oh, yeah.
In any kind of the either fairy or UFO abductions. And again, like this book, Passport to Magonia, kind of compiles all of these things and doesn't make it doesn't really make a thesis or anything. It's really just kind of like presenting this information to be considered, which is really, really cool. Like one of my favorite quotes that I kind of underlined in the book says, "It is important, however, to note the continuum of beliefs, for the continuum leads directly from primitive magic through mystical experience, the fairy faith, and religion to modern flying saucers." Yeah. And once you start looking at all that kind of stuff, now, am I sitting here saying like any kind of religious archetypes and any kind of religious beliefs or old sacred texts and all this kind of stuff, are they talking about UFOs and all this kind of stuff? Hey, man, I don't know, and I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is it's extremely interesting how humankind have had these experiences with, I'm just going to call them otherworldly beings. Yeah. And so many of the experiences are parallel in what happened,
Yeah, to me, that's one of the cooler things about this. I think if you're open enough to, kind of the way that Jacques Vallée does it is he doesn't necessarily come down on one side or the other. It's very sort of like, these are the stories, these are the facts, these are the reports or the evidence. And to me, it's interesting because it's like you have, even if you look back biblically in Ezekiel, Ezekiel's wheel, they call it, but like he had visions of these wheels within wheels. And they're actually a type of angel called the Ophanim, which in Hebrew just means wheels, or the Galgalim, I think. I may be messing that up, but basically their literal shape is just these sort of glowing, spinning wheels within wheels, or like almost like a gyroscope. And so, if you're open enough to not let the dogma of whatever religion you're in or whatever, I feel like as humans, we know so little that I think it's okay to just say, I don't know. And I think it's okay also to say, well, even in the Bible, he had visions of these spinning wheels, and those were angels. Well, I don't think it's that far of a leap to draw the comparison of, I have some instances that I had or encounters or whatever that, we'll eventually get to on an episode where I saw these orbs in my old loft that I used to live in up in Cleveland, Georgia. And, you start to think and draw the sort of the parallels to, how different was what I saw? How different was that to what maybe Ezekiel saw in his vision in the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
I love that stuff. I love just how similar a lot of it is if you're open enough to kind of just look at it from the surface of being like, I don't know, maybe they are the same things. What are the little drawing or the little paintings, the little discs, that were painted in all of the Renaissance paintings? Mm-hmm. It's like, how do we know that? I think it's just so easy to be like, oh, well, and the skeptics will just immediately dismiss it and say, oh, well, that was just a marker of the times, and that was just the sun or the moon. It's like, I don't believe that for a second. Some of them literally, if you get up close, you literally see a little man in a ship. And this is long before dirigibles, long before any sort of blimps or any kind of flying device. And so how is it that much of a leap to think all those things, the masters, the great Renaissance painters of their time, were seeing the exact same thing that these two ladies were seeing in 1976.
100%. And then also, like, this is just going to give you an example of how Jacques Vallée, if you're picking up his book to kind of get an answer, you're going to be frustrated. Because, like, just as a point, like, this is such a great quote from his book, and it says, "It would be nice to hold on to the common belief that the UFOs are craft from a superior space civilization, because this is a hypothesis science fiction has made widely acceptable, because we are not altogether unprepared scientifically and even perhaps militarily to deal with such visitors. Unfortunately, however, the theory that flying saucers are material objects from outer space manned by a race originating on some other planet is not a complete answer. However strong the current belief in saucers from space, it cannot be stronger than the Celtic faith in the elves and the fairies, or the medieval belief in lutins, or the fear throughout the Christian lands in the first centuries of our era of demons and satyrs and fauns. Certainly, it cannot be stronger than the faith that inspired the writers of the Bible, a faith rooted in daily experiences with angelic visitation."
Oh, there you go.
In short, by suggesting that modern UFO sightings might be the result of experiments of a scientific or even super scientific nature conducted by a race of space travelers, we may be the victims of our own ignorance. And so,
yeah, that's
it's
great.
just incredible, because it just really kind of, I don't know, just opens up the possibilities for not only just one set of sort of ideas of what these kind of things are, but a ton of sets of different creatures from all around the world and all different parts of human history and stuff. Like we kind of said at the top of the show, we've kind of, not avoided, but maybe just a little bit of avoidance in covering even just a single encounter like the Stanford abduction, just because there's just so much that we feel, or we felt like we might be doing like a disservice to it in general.
Right.
But I think this is a great way to kind of get started, then to get our listeners like interested in kind of looking up stuff, on their own, like grabbing a copy of Passport to Magonia, or the other book that I kind of got this abduction story from was by Brad Steiger, and it's called Real Monsters, Gruesome Critters, and Beasts from the Dark Side. And, it's a great book for just story after story after story about everything you could think of.
Yeah. And I think, let me say this too, I know that we're kind of glossing over it, and honestly, I think this deserves its own episode. We keep talking about the fairies, and so I think it's important that we put it out there that you got to think, like, everything that we just when we hear the word fairy, we're thinking of Tinkerbell, we're thinking of cartoons and merchandise and toys made for little girls, and honestly, that's not how they've ever been portrayed throughout history until the late 1800s. Fairies didn't even, the concept of fairies even having wings didn't even come out, I don't think, until there's a particular little era that includes Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He wrote Sherlock Holmes and all that, but these little girls claim to see these fairies in England, and it's called the Cottingley fairies if you want to look it up. But the idea that they even had wings kind of originated sort of around that time, sort of the more Victorian era, similar to how like the cherub angels, were kind of given that look as like little babies, in the the Renaissance era. None of these things like the cherubs were not even, that's not a biblical thing. That's not how they were supposed to look. Same with the fairies. They were just kind of created and given this look, and that's how we've portrayed it from then until now. And so I think it does a little bit of a disservice to the concept, and it kind of gaslights it in a way of like, oh, well, I'm not going to take that seriously because, what are they talking about? Tinkerbell. And it's like, well, that's not really how it's ever been looked at. I mean, these were things that were looked at as very, very serious. I mean, especially in like the Celtic, fairy faith and like the Druids and all that stuff. I mean, it was very, very serious. I mean, you didn't, there were certain things you didn't do. There were certain, you would carry a piece of iron in your pocket to keep the dark fairies away. There's all these like little sort of rituals and like little superstitious things that they would do, but these are all like very serious things. These aren't just like these cute little, kind of fairies as we're sort of, made to believe.
More accustomed to now.
Yeah.
And I kind of reside right on the fence of both sides of that in terms of.
Tonight's program has been brought to you by
Tyler, man, there's one thing that got me through this COVID craziness. I got in the mail a couple of items from our merch store. And I got to tell you, man, this crew neck sweater is maybe one of the most comfortable things I have ever worn. The inside of it is like, I don't know how to explain it, man. I'm never going to take this thing off.
Wait a minute, we have sweaters?
I mean, you know what I'm saying, sweatshirts. This sweatshirt is the most comfortable thing I have ever put on. I also got this like really cool trucker cap that says B-Rad on it. I mean, I think if people haven't already, they need to go check out our merchandise store. They can find it at shop.spreadshirt.com/thatwouldberad. So again, that's shop.spreadshirt.com/thatwouldberad.
America's future can be determined by our dreams and our visions.
It was very intense, bright light.
For over 200 years, there have been reports of giant man-like creatures
From another dimension, another world, I don't know.
the most intriguing mystery on the North American continent.
You're listening to That Would Be Rad.
Like in some ways, there's just this new movie that came out on Netflix. It's like The Bigfoot Family or something. You know?
Yeah.
Like the dad is a scientist. He was performing some kind of genetic experiments and mixed some DNA with Bigfoot, became Bigfoot and whatever. And like part of me while I was watching it with my kids this weekend, I was kind of like, what a way to just make it stupid.
Sort of homogenize
but at the same time,
Bigfoot,
but at the same time, it also provides like a little sort of like anchor point in these kids' minds that kind of can make them a little bit more interested to learn about like the other stuff later in life.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And so even movies like, Men in Black, even though they're not even close to being realistic about, the real sort of Men in Black stuff, it's still kind of fun to. It's entertaining. Anyway, is the short version of it.
Yeah.
You know what else is kind of funny about all these? Tyler, especially in comparison to me, just like automatically has this knowledge just like stored in his memory banks. A lot of it is new for me, which is super fun to kind of learn about this stuff.
Oh yeah.
But it's buried so like strongly and deeply rooted in so much that even in our D&D campaign, when our characters were, taken to this like safe place by this lady, our characters had like fought through the 9 hells and had been like fighting demons and all this kind of stuff, and we rescued this lady, and she takes us to this like safe sanctuary or whatever, and she offers us food, and Tyler's like, wait a second, man, if
never take the food or drink.
Never take the food or drink, otherwise, whatever. And then, of course, we're just kind of like, come on, man, But it's just funny because it's like that's how deeply rooted when we're thinking about all kinds of things,
Which, if you're interested in the food and drink of fairies or ETs or all that stuff. There's an author by the name of Joshua Cutchin who is a brilliant writer. He's written a book called The Trojan Feast. You can get it on Amazon or whatever, but it's a really, really cool way. And the entire book is just sort of talking about, sort of partaking in like the food or drink of a lot, all of these sort of phenomena and like what the sort of repercussions are. Because that was the thing is like with the fairies is like you never ever, basically if you were abducted by the fairies or taken, they would take you to wherever their fairyland was. And again, this is very, very like serious stuff to those people back then. And it was just like the number one thing was like never drink, never eat, because that would anchor you to that world so you could never come back. And it is interesting because there's a lot of similarities and a lot of parallels to, kind of doing the same thing with sort of the nuts and bolts, like early, mid 50s UFO lore.
Alien grade type stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and what was the one, I'm putting myself on the spot, but basically the guy came out of a craft and he offered.
You're talking about the pancakes?
Yeah, the buckwheat pancakes.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I can't think of it.
I can't think of it either. Darn it.
I mean, it's easy to find. Just look it up. But this was like 50s, maybe even 40s, actually.
Mm-hmm. And he saved, I think, some of them. Yep. And there's like a picture in the newspaper where he's like holding up one of these like, bland pancakes or whatever.
Well, I got to say, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I do have to say the one interesting thing about that is...
Well, you're not sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. The one interesting thing about the pancakes is he was given, I think 3. I think he tried one, actually. The other one he ended up giving to the police department, which eventually made it into the hands of the FBI, which is kind of wild. But one of the things about it, whenever they did testing, is it had 0 trace of sodium or basically salt. Right. And that's another interesting thing. If you look back at, like, in fairy lore, salt was a thing that repelled the fairies.
And demons, too.
And demons. And then and same with, like, demons. And if you look into the Middle East, the way that we view sort of demons, they have the jinn, which DJINN, which another thing that's sort of been sort of watered down and Disney-fied or whatever, the genie. But yeah, these are all like really things that were pretty vicious and were really taken seriously back in the day. And but it's fascinating.
And I think with all that stuff too, as much of there is kind of like scary, kind of darker type stuff, there's also like good, happy stuff too.
Oh yeah,
amongst all these cultures and stuff. But just like anything, good and evil exists, and I think it doesn't, discriminate on which world it belongs. Another thing too that's really fascinating, kind of circling back to, was what we saw in my backyard a UFO or not? I don't know, but I think it's really cool. You can hear in the video, my son goes, "Yeah, but the UFOs in Dad's book are kind of more like white."
Oh, that's awesome.
And so it's just neat to kind of look at that stuff. I will say, for the most part, I kind of don't make those things super, super scary for the kids.
Yeah,
because of all the things that we read or listen to, and listening to like the latest episode of the Belief Hole podcast, there's scary stuff out there, stuff that like, as a dad that's an avid camper, somebody that just loves the outdoors, gosh, man, some of that stuff is pretty dang freaky. And it's like, I don't really want to give my kids, but certainly not my wife, any more fuel to basically say, no, I don't want to go camping. So anyway, I just keep it really light with the kids.
You have to.
In all of that stuff. Otherwise, Gab will never go to the woods and stuff. And that's not cool with me. So,
well, before we kind of move on, let's talk a little bit more about your UFO thing. First thing, have you done, like I said, have you filed a MUFON report?
No, I haven't filed the MUFON report yet, but I'm going to. Although I got to be honest with you, man, part of me is a little nervous too, because I don't want to be put on the quote unquote radar of
dude, MUFON is like looked at as like a joke, I'm sure, by any sort of government type.
I mean, you think that, but like, look, here's something else that was fascinating. Just in the news relatively recently, you had that American Airlines, which, by the way, like, I hate American Airlines. I don't. But anyway, the recent event where something flew over top. It's kind of like in our intro song. That's audio actually taken from a UFO encounter that two pilots had on a commercial airliner. And so that recently happened again. There's been a lot of UFO activity out in Los Angeles. I think it's a mixture of a lot of things. You know, if I just had to put like my thumb on it and say, okay, here's what it is, if you're listening and you want one of those kind of answers, here's what I think it is. I think, yes, there are a lot of really amazing high-tech things our government, our military and stuff have their hands on that is relatively top secret for a more like security purpose, you know, to have like the fastest or the quietest or the best planes or aircraft and whatever, manned or unmanned, in the field.
Yeah.
Period.
Yep.
I definitely think that's a possibility. I also think that there are tons of super rad things that exist that we don't really know anything about.
No.
But reading about all of the things, again, spanning human history that have occurred, that have parallel sort of almost like bullet point things that happened, you know, way back in time, even in the medieval time.
Oh, yeah.
You know? That similarly occur now is just so fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of our approach to it is when you look at these things, you can kind of like look at it and say, you know, I might not believe in that, or I might be able to dismiss that, but that would be rad. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. One thing though, again, going back to your sort of the video you took, you know, I gotta say, my first thought was like, oh well, this is kind of looks like a heart balloon, but then it doesn't have any of the characteristics of like a mylar balloon. I know the skeptics are immediately going to say, oh well, that's a Chinese lantern, but it doesn't look anything like that. It's kind of spinning, and to me, and this is just my sort of subjective view on it, it looks like it has like a little bit of, how do you explain it? Almost like it has like a weight. It doesn't look like it's this super flimsy, you know, not even like a, 1/10 of a pound, this tiny mylar balloon. I just feel like that thing would just be going nuts, and like the wind currents and stuff would just be flipping that thing all over the place. This looks like it has a little more weight because it is spinning, but it's kind of end over end, and it almost looks like it's, I don't know. I don't know.
It's weird because like at different points, even when it was flying like directly overhead, it kind of, at first you would think, oh, that spinning is like a consistent pattern or something, but then it would do sort of a random spin.
Right.
And I mean, and then it would just not do anything. It would just like kind of fly. And it wasn't like, you read a bunch of accounts where somebody sees an object and then just like darts in another direction, like super fast.
Yeah.
It really wasn't like that. It was kind of just a consistent flight path.
Yeah.
But with some, interesting maneuvers and stuff that made me think, in terms of just like sheer physics, it was just hard it wasn't like, oh, that's normal for a man-made aircraft to do. So, I don't know. I'm super, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm excited to kind of see what people think and comment on the, on our Instagram where we'll post the video.
Yeah.
And just to kind of see, like, what are people's thoughts? Do they think it was a balloon? Was it a plastic bag? Again, like you said, it didn't really have the consistency to me of being so flimsy that it was like a plastic bag. It didn't have like that wave kind of that you would imagine a piece of plastic. It's something substantial enough that, the closest thing that I could even think would be some sort of like balloon. But again, like, and it's just hard to see from the footage that I have, but when it was directly overhead, there was no markings. Nothing that would indicate that it was anything. There was no shimmer to it. It was just super flat black, no sound.
And that is the thing with like, any balloon that could make it that high and that would be sort of flipping and sort of spinning end over end, it would be a mylar balloon. And even if somebody went so far as to like sort of spray paint it flat black, I still feel like you would see that shimmer kind of shining through, because that sort of metallic looking, the one sort of polarizing thing and the frustrating part I think about, having these amazing cameras in our pocket, with our phones, is like for this, for example, it's, they're so far away, you have to zoom in. So then you zoom in and then you get the shaky cam effect. And so everybody is immediately going to jump on the I don't say everybody, I mean every sort of overtly skeptical person is going to say like, oh, well, it's so shaky you can't see anything. This has got to be this. And but I don't know, man. It is interesting. And maybe it is, I'm fine with this being a mundane thing. If somebody offers a suggestion of like, oh, well, my dad works with this, and this is this type of weather balloon or whatever. I mean, maybe it is, but to me, it does look. It's an interesting video for sure.
It's super interesting, and I mean, like I said at the very, very beginning, no matter what, even if it is just a balloon, fine, that's awesome. It was just a cool experience, and then also, it really did teach me about like, how easily it is to miss a good shot. And also have like relatively shaky footage that just isn't ideal. So, and I think it's just a perfect, excuse for us to do a UFO episode. So I hope everybody listening enjoyed the account of the Stanford abduction. Let me ask you this. Let's close it with an answer to this question. Okay. Do people need to be like afraid? Because there's a lot of people out there that are just like terrified. Yeah. Myself included, after like Unsolved Mysteries when I was a kid. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do people need to be terrified of something like this happening to them?
You mean like the Stanford?
Yeah, being abducted, or just do these beings have ill will mostly, or what are your thoughts?
Well, as far as like the abduction stuff, this falling into the nuts and bolts sort of era, I think that would just be so terrifying, because, would we have a 747 back then? It's just a totally different thing. So I think, and again, this is another road we could kind of go down super far. To me, the abduction stuff is more of a maybe dimensional thing, maybe spiritual, astral projection, like sort of leaning into that kind of thing, where but then it's weird when it's paired with like around the 50s, 60s, and 70s to these like nuts and bolts crafts. So I don't think we're really seeing those things much anymore. And if you're like me, I think that if we're seeing a lot of this stuff now, like the full-on crafts, like the Tic Tac UFO footage, or the gimbal UFO footage that was released by the Pentagon. I think if you're seeing that stuff, maybe it is UFOs. I think a lot of what we are seeing is sort of reverse engineered, Bob Lazar, Area 51 style. I think now, more so than then, if you were going to be fearful about these things, it would be these sort of abductions, in like a sleep state, or in more of that kind of thing,
Yeah. And just to circle it fully back around to our last episode last week, the mega long Mandela Effect episode, one last thing to kind of plant into your brain, listener, is let's just say that CERN has figured out a way to go back in time. Yeah. Imagine somebody performing just relatively normal physical examination of someone from back then to, maybe get a better idea of DNA, how they were different. Did they contain like something that would help us fight off disease, whatever it is, okay? Right. Whatever the reason. I know that was kind of a jumbled thought.
No. I think I know what you're saying.
I just mean like these rifts in time and space and stuff, and people seeing crafts from, to me, it's so fascinating to think that maybe 200 years from now,
this is your
we figure out,
favorite.
Dude, 200 years from now, we figure out, hey, look, man, we could actually be a lot better off humanity-wise if we because we've got this technology, we can kind of go back, make small changes here and there to maybe make some better, less tragic outcomes occur. And maybe like our generation is the one that is kind of like stuck between those two things. And so we're kind of like able to see
the changes.
Oh, wait, this is different than it was when we were kids. Something's happening. You know, our reality is kind of getting blurred in this thing. And like the people younger than us and the people older than us there's more of a distinction. And so it's like easier for them to kind of, you know, I don't know, whatever, right? Maybe that's why when we look back at our lifetimes, there's like all these events that happened, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, just seems like in our lifetime, so many just intense things have happened.
Yeah.
Maybe they were supposed to be worse, or maybe they're things that will be corrected later. I mean,
I'm always going to steer the ship to fairy abductions and
yeah, which I love, man.
It's awesome. God, I'm so glad that you read Passport.
So much better. Yeah, dude, it's so much better than just like the traditional like, whoa, there's aliens. Because like I kind of said, I don't care if it's, hey, there's just aliens, or hey, there's all these things, and people just have all these accounts and they kind of like blend together. It's just amazing stuff, man. Passport it's become like one of my favorite books.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna buy that Disembodied Voices book that they talk about on that Belief Hole episode.
Oh yeah, dude.
Yeah, it looks pretty amazing. Cool. What's crazy though is the guy, and I actually found a podcast episode where the author was like given an interview, and he refers to it as it's called like the Nishi, which I don't know how we've never sort of figured it out, but apparently I think that's sort of an overarching kind of sort of grab all for, you know, those abducting things. Those like, yeah,
because didn't they say something about that, like, or like make reference to that?
And I'd never heard of that.
I feel like I had enough to where it didn't seem unfamiliar, but God, man, and like that's what I'm talking about, dude. The thing being like calling the kid from the woods, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of Sam the Sandown Clown.
Yeah.
It reminds me of all that stuff.
It reminds me of me at the fucking hospital, which
dude,
was so scary whenever I heard that. It was just like, it hit me. I was like getting ready and I was like listening, but I was like getting ready at the same time. And it was just like, wait a minute. Like, because if you look at it as like the same sort of way of like, hey, it's like the siren song, the thing that's going to, the will of the wisp, the thing that's going to lead you into danger and possibly or abduct you. And it's like, you know, when they were talking about, you know, how would that look in the modern age? And it's like, now you're hearing beeps and like recorded messages.
Yeah, or recorded like fake voice of like, it reminds me of everything from like Flight of the wasn't it Flight of the Navigator? It called him into the woods. And then like just a bunch of that kind of stuff, man, where you just like, and see, that's what I'm talking about, man. It's like, God, dude, I mean, like I definitely don't want to go camping by myself.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just, it's freaky, dude.
Well, one thing too that you probably wouldn't know unless you've like really listened to like almost all the episodes of Strange Familiars, but he even has a story, like one of his, like maybe even like the sort of weird sort of thing that kind of set him into this is like same kind of thing. He was in the woods, everything went totally quiet, and out of nowhere he hears like this weird like digital like beep or like a like it sounded. He said he made it out like it sounded like an 8-bit Atari video game sound. And this is in the middle of the woods. No one is around. Almost like the simulation hit like a glitch, which is just why. And that, again, that goes, but he said like the forest went dead quiet. All the animals stopped making noise. He felt a feeling of dread. And then he heard like a weird, like 8-bit, you know, kind of sound, which is so just like, it's just something that doesn't belong in that setting, you know? Which is wild.
Yeah, man.
So
that's super, super bizarre.
Yeah.
We could just go on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
But instead of doing that, we'll save all that stuff for future episodes. I mean, I just want to, you know, I think, especially after last week's long episode, I think one of the things that has really just come to light over the past 27 episodes,
man, that's crazy,
for us, for this podcast, is just how cool it is that we have this community of people that we get to interact with.
Yeah.
You know, every day or so. But I mean, certainly after we publish an episode, folks coming in and kind of like giving their take on it, or sending us, pictures of things that deal with that episode, or giving their opinions on things. It's just like this little community of people that are like-minded,
right?
And that's really, aside from us just wanting to hang out more and talk about this kind of stuff in general, being like one of the reasons why we started this.
Oh yeah,
it was also to bring together people like us.
Yeah. We were talking yesterday about us not really being a podcast like a lot of other podcasts. Not really. Woody and I are into so much stuff that's so varied and so whatever. So for us, it's not really. We never really wanted to create a podcast that was sort of created for a particular topic or field, like just paranormal stuff or just 80s nostalgia or just this. The whole reason for the podcast is more of an appeal to the same kind of people that we are, who would be into all this stuff, and say maybe you don't really know about UFO events of the 70s, or whatever. If you're like us and you're kind of that kind of person around that kind of age group, around that kind of general sort of interest, you can trust us to know that you'll probably be glad you did by the end of it.
As we just can't thank every single person that takes the time out of their busy days to give us a listen. We just we love it.
Yeah,
so
we really do. If you have some stuff to say to us and you're on Instagram, shoot us a DM, stories, accounts or whatever, or if it's sort of more of a long form thing, feel free to shoot it to our email address, which is thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com. So yeah, pretty much like Woody said, thanks for coming back week after week. We wouldn't be able to do it without you. We love you, we appreciate you, and as always,
be rad.
That's the way it goes. Time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead before you became a ghost. You always said our future would be a parade of